This is Imagine Air Theater. I'm your host, Terry Phillips. You're about to hear episode 1 of a special 4-part miniseries called The Most Dangerous Man. It's co-authored by Roy Schreiber and me. Unlike previous plays in this podcast, which are works of fiction, this one is a historical drama based on real events.
Well, hello again. This is Buck Benny speaking. We have a special show today. Terry is dropping another one of his Imaginary Theater episodes, and it actually has already dropped the first one. It's a 4-part miniseries, and we'll get all into that in just a minute, but I thought I'd introduce our folks first. So, of course, we have Terry Phillips here, and in a great hat. I love that. And Kathy Fuller Seeley. Hey, Kathy. And we have John Henderson as well.
Hello.
And we have a guest. So maybe I will hand that off to you, Terry, to introduce our guest and why our guest is here.
Well, this is my co-author on this special Imaginary Theater miniseries. Roy Schreiber is a historian, and he is the one who suggested the topic for this.
Wow.
And Roy, welcome to the group.
Yeah, nice to be here. Glad to be part of it.
That's great. Thanks, Roy. So I'll ask Roy the first question since he's our guest. Roy, what's the genesis of this between you and Terry figuring out to do this thing? I mean, were you guys friends ahead of time and you just approached him on this, or knew that he did Imaginary Theater? I don't know how that all came about.
No, there was an advert in the Dramatists Guild, and I'm calling it an advert, a notice that Terry put up saying that he was looking for a collaborator, and he described what he was looking for, and it sounded like something that would fit me. So I contacted him, and we began chatting and trying to come up with a topic.
And Terry, so you were looking for collaboration. You've done all these on your own. Why were you all of a sudden looking for a collaborator?
All but one.
It feels like
we actually did have one episode drafted by another playwright, someone I had met through the Dramatist Guild, and I enjoyed that process very much. And I've collaborated with other people over the years. Right. Mostly in writing sitcoms and in the news business. You know, nobody writes, especially television, alone. But I had wanted to share this the joy and the burden of this process with another playwright, and I was delighted when Roy contacted me. I had heard from a couple of others, but they didn't particularly seem like a good fit. One was a lyricist, and this is not a musical.
That would have been interesting to do a musical.
Sure, and I'm not opposed to that idea.
I mean, I can help you with that too. Imaginary Theater. I think that'd be great. Yeah, that'd be good.
But yeah, I very much wanted to work with somebody. I do have a longtime collaborator. We were actually best friends from high school. Who is our script consultant on every episode of Imaginary Theater, Mark Boyce. And so he has a hand in every one of these, but he's not a writer. As he would say, he's a critic. So he takes the scripts that I've drafted and then the one that Roy and I drafted, and will give me feedback on plot points, on dialogue. He has a good ear for these things. And so that's always been nice, but it was especially wonderful to have somebody actually doing the writing. And we can get into this if you want, but we kind of, shared, I would say, roughly 50-50 the writing. Wouldn't you say, Roy?
Yeah, that's about what it worked out to.
Yeah.
And I'll throw this out there just because chances are I assume that whatever applies to me applies to everybody on the planet, but I don't think that really is necessarily the case. But when I was listening to this, just because of the time frame being almost exactly 100 years ago, it sort of, when they started talking about dates and things, and it just made it feel more like oh, I can understand. Oh, that was about 15 years ago that they're talking, whatever. Whereas a lot of times you hear dates, and if they're way off, like, the 1940s or something, you're like, uh, you just think of all of it as old, and you don't really think about in their time how many years have gone by between the points they're talking about. Whereas this way it made it really easy to go, oh, that's like for me, it somehow it just made you get into it more because it was almost exactly 100 years ago, which
In
I
a
love.
sense, we got lucky because
Yeah.
we got this parallelism
Yeah.
here that didn't necessarily have to be the case. The other thing is uh, I know very well that people react badly to listening to dates. Oh God, another date, and they don't. It turns them off instantaneously. The flip side to that is if you don't give people some frame of reference, they don't know where they're at.
Right.
So it's a really fine line uh, trying to get it in there without getting it in there without people realizing that that's what you're doing, because as soon as they cotton to what you're doing, it turns them off instantaneously.
Yeah. No, I agree 100% on that. And I love the fact that this is right around the time of World War I, in that, again, like we've talked before on our podcast, how the time from 1946 to like 50 is not a very explored time, where it just doesn't seem like we have much material covering that. World War II, we have a whole bunch of material covering that in films and books and a million things. World War I, it just doesn't feel like it's ever touched upon quite as much. And I think maybe it's because the warfare was harder to make interesting because you're sort of in a trench and looking at a guy in another trench, and how exciting is that? Whatever. So I'm not sure. They did a great job with Wonder Woman in that. But no, but I was just going to say that what I find, the time frames that are not well represented, it seems like, you know, is pretty much the time from about 1900 to 1920 something, 25, is the one that we just don't spend a lot of time on. I mean, you get the Great Gatsby and things like that, but you don't, there's, we just spend so much time in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and World War II, that all of that is covered really well. So to get something that's rich and interesting, that's from a time frame that we don't spend a lot of time with, and that's not even this, it's from a time that's World War I, but it's not a war story. It's a behind the scenes sort of political piece slash just human interest drama piece that makes it be like, oh, I've never spent time like that with these kind of, I would expect, if, oh, it's World War II, I'm going to spend time with soldiers, and I'm going to spend time with some sort of warfare thing, whatever. And this is different. But having said all that, I'm going to turn it over to some of our other folks to see what questions they have. And because I have a million questions, but I don't want to hog the time like I usually do. So let's go over to Kathy, a resident historian. Kathy, what was interesting about this, or what questions did you have for Terry about this thing?
Well, I just wanted to compliment the authors because this seems so contemporary in so many ways. American involvement in World War II was short and brief, but intense, and it was happening somewhere else. Like today, we are caught up in a conflict that's happening somewhere else, in which there are very sharp political opinions and debates about should we be involved, should we not be involved, who's right, who's, all these things. It's sharply contemporary, and I love how our authors here present major issues in ways that are very relatable, very personable, related to people and related to sort of ethics and what do you think is right to do, as well as I said, involving of presidential figures. And so it involves a marvelous mixture of big, important issues, intellectual issues, and personal choices. And I really like that. And I'm curious, Terry and Roy, what do you all think of Eugene V. Debs, the man? does in doing your research and writing about this, what kind of a character or person did he seem to you? What stuck with you about him?
Well, Roy, since you introduced the topic to me, why don't you take this?
Okay, well, uh, he's a man who comes across as very uh, staunch in his beliefs. Um, I think in the play itself, we used the his wife said he had his head in the clouds, and he knew that, which was interesting with him. One of the remarks that I heard here that he's recorded to have made is that he'd be a terrible president because he he was so unpractical. He didn't have a practical bone in his body. Uh, the other thing that as the more I looked at him, the more I got the same reaction. Nobody really who knew him disliked him. Even the people who were way on the other side politically from him found him a terribly personable man. He was a nice guy. Uh, the other thing that I found strange, uh, I think from its inception, Terre Haute, Indiana, is not exactly a hotbed of socialism, and the idea that this guy somehow or other came out of Terre Haute, Indiana, uh, just left me shaking my head a little bit. Where in the world is he getting this stuff from? He just seemed uh, a very strange kind of person to be coming from there. His wife, who you get a
I
little bit of
believe he got most of
impression
the
of.
information from social media, I believe is
Yeah, yeah, there you go. Uh, yeah, well, of course, eh, in those days, it's the newspapers that are everything.
yeah.
There is no other mass communication that people are going to have. So what shows up in the newspapers matters a great deal.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. John, did you have any questions
I
for
love a
me?
great audio drama. I thought that there's implications to and parallels to modern politics, and I appreciated that you present the facts and implications, but there's still room for your own conclusions and things like that. So, I mean, for me, I'm not a kind of person who presents my political opinions publicly and things like that. If my wife said to me, "Stay home, John," I'd be like, "Okay, I'll stay home. I'm not going to go do the speech." But I think this is a great conversation starter and a really interesting case. And I think that it's well written for an audio format, and so it comes across really well that way. I really love the way that it's broken up into four places. And like an old time serial, there's cliffhangers in just the right place.
Yes.
So if
And
I was
they,
asked a question, I'd like to know about the production, the actual creating of
yeah.
the audio.
Well, I can talk a little bit about that.
Mhm.
Since this was a much more ambitious project than our previous ones with a much larger cast, I relied much more heavily on our casting director, Stella Valente, who also, as an actor, portrayed Kate Debs. And she came up with, I think, an amazing group of performers. I was in awe of how well they did. And these were, I mean, it was a process for her. These were people who auditioned for these roles, and she culled, I think, the best available people. And I'll just, as an aside, say that this is the first time that we're paying actors, in part because, I mean, we should always pay people for
Right.
their professional work, but uh, I felt and Roy felt that it was important in this case. They were doing such uh, a great job of delivering and making this as believable as it was. As before, they were recording their parts individually and separately and in various places around the country. And then they would send me their audio files, and I would cut them together and throw in sound effects and music. it's part of the process I enjoy a lot. It was a little frustrating this time because my software crashed on me at one
Oh,
point. But luckily, I had saved the work before that happened, so we were able to pull it off without too much pain. And now my hope is that with conversations like this, that we'll be able to deliver it to a large enough audience that it will have some impact. And the impact, I agree with you, John. It's nice for people to have their own political views and for that not to be not to interfere with civil conversations. And I hope this will be another way to do that. I think it's an amazing story, and the fact that we were able to make it um, relatable and relevant makes me very happy.
I love the fact that in this first one, because I only listened to the first one, John heard more of them, but in the first one, there's a large piece of it is dialogue between two people and trying to make a decision of what the person should do. And hearing them go back and forth makes you feel like, what would I say? What would my advice be to these people? And it just sucks you into that whole piece. It's just a wonderful first piece. That I had a couple questions kind of about this, tying on to what John was saying. One is, um, how do you decide, okay, we're going to do this as one presentation, or we're going to do this as a two-parter, or in this case, we're going to do it as a four-part thing? Does it come, do you write the story and go, this is just too much story to fit? And so how can we break it up? And, oh, it naturally breaks it four way. I don't know, but you can tell us how that works. And then the other piece is, did you design it like, as you're writing a four-part piece like this, does a person write it like the old style where you do want a cliffhanger at the end? Do you want kind of a beginning, middle, and end to each of the four parts individually, plus like a little cliffhanger? I don't know how that all works. I just know I'm in awe of the way these things are put together. So either of you can answer that one.
Roy, you and I talked about this a lot initially.
Yes, we did. Yes,
Why
we
don't you tell
did.
that story?
Yeah, well, I mean, part of it is that it ends up being a kind of natural progression. You figure that each of the sessions, if you're going to keep people's interest, can't really go 20 minutes is probably about the edge of what you want to do in terms of keeping people tuned into what you're doing. So as you sit down and write, um, the uh, the rule of thumb, which the rest of you may or may not know, is that one page equals a minute when you're doing your writing. So as you sit down and write it and you put the thing together, by the time you put the thing together, you know how many minutes you've got, or pretty close to how many minutes you've got, and then you start looking. Well, obviously this is more than one.
Mhm.
So then you start looking for the dividing lines. Where do you split it up? How do you divide it? Okay, you got it divided. Now, how do you go from one episode to the next episode and keep the interest going? And that's where where Terry was very good at figuring out how to do the cliffhangers and put them together and go from one to the other, and how much of each uh, episode has a little bit of the last episode in it in order to refresh people's memories. Uh, uh, that that was very impressive. It's one of the reasons I enjoyed working with Terry.
Fantastic.
That's
Terry, you got anything to add to that?
I think Terry and Roy are both master storytellers, investigators, and teachers, because these sound, I mean, as well as just a great thing to listen to. This will also be useful in I can see it being used by teachers in classrooms, because I find it very engaging, of the people involved and the questions it raises, just as everybody has said, not coming up with any particular point of view, but making the listener think, what would I do? What's my opinion? Oh, look at all different sides of the issues. And I love how it's broken up in 4 bits, but I also love that you can have some that were slightly shorter and some that were slightly longer, not being within the tyranny of commercial media production. 20, where a sitcom episode must be exactly this long. I love that in the sort of Netflix model, you're able to make them what they want to be. And I feel incredibly grateful that we have this marvelous project from you all.
I will say that it makes life a whole lot easier, uh, not to have this routine of it's got to be X amount of time and can be absolutely no longer
Yeah.
as you go through these things. I did uh, I did another a radio podcast thing about a group of women in South Bend, Indiana, at a factory, uh, who back in the 1970s, who sued Bendix for discrimination and for uh, equal pay and equal work. It took them 10 years, and they finally won their case. But I did that for NPR, and God, that was rough because I mean, there's no margin. I had like a 15-second margin or something on
Yeah.
each of these things. Fortunately, I had a professional editor who was good at trimming and getting these things into shape. But if I had to do it myself, it would have driven me absolutely right up the wall.
Yeah, and that's so unfortunate because the story suffers for that. If you have to, oh, this story really is a 20-minute story, but I got to do 25, so I've got to pad it. Or this story really needs 30 minutes, but I need to cut five no matter what. And so I'm cutting five that are important 5 minutes out of this thing because I got to get it to 25. I mean, I just love the model where it's like, hey, people are listening. They're going to listen to however long you give them, and they're going to want the best possible story. And it goes whatever length it goes. Because I want to say one of these is 12, another's 13, and then I think the last two are 18 each. And
Yeah,
I think
it's just great.
that's really crazy numbers, but it's like, why not? And I think it's fantastic to get the story told in the right way. So
I
thank
always
you.
worry about my work being too long. There's a wonderful story, perhaps apocryphal, I don't know, and it doesn't matter. Um, two guys are corresponding with each other, and one of them says at the end of one missive, "I'm sorry to have written such a long letter. I didn't have time to write a shorter one."
Yeah.
That is so accurate. That is so very accurate.
And I always appreciate tight writing. I was taught to do that. And I was also taught that the worst sin you can commit in the theater is to be boring. And so I do worry about going on too long in some of the things I write. So I hope this won't be an example of that. It feels like these are good, nice bite-sized portions that shouldn't be too much of a burden on anybody.
Absolutely. And I think if you go back to radio when radio was king back in the 50s and the 40s and 30s, um, they could have an hour and a half drama that they would do and people would listen to the whole thing. That's great. But it's hard presenting something like that now. Invariably, no matter who I have acting in it, it could be Jimmy Stewart and Orson Welles and whoever else. When I look at the numbers from our podcast of how many people will tune into an hour and a half performance, I mean, a lot of people will hop on at the beginning, but by 12, 15 minutes in, they're all hopping back off and going, I don't have time to listen to this. I'll listen to it later, whatever they do. And so you don't get as many listeners. And I think with modern, just the way we as a society are even speeding things up more, it makes it where it does presenting something in bite-sized chunks like this is makes much more sense for people. And also just people on the go and on their commute. Uh, how many people have an hour and a half commute? A lot of people commute for their half hour, and your shows can fit in with that, and they can listen to one a day for 4 days, and then they've listened to the whole thing, and they can enjoy that. So
Amazing how people can watch 100 3-minute videos, but never a 10-minute
Yeah.
video
yes,
or
yes.
whatever.
Well, I love
Yeah.
it because YouTube actually shows you the numbers as your numbers dwindle or whatever.
Wow.
And almost everything I play, it doesn't matter what we play, you get a ton of listeners, watchers for the first 5 or 7 minutes, and it always goes down steeply, and then it kind of levels off usually, but you lose all these people that just, I'm sure they're on to the next video. I don't have time for this, whatever. And yeah, it's weird, but it is what it is.
It is the age of the tweet, although I
Yeah.
guess we can't call it that anymore, whatever we're supposed to call
The
it.
age of the X.
Yes.
Do you still call? No one knows what to call an X message anymore. I think people still just call it a tweet. I mean,
Tweet.
I think so.
It's kind of like it became generic name like Kleenex or
Yeah.
Hoover or Kodak or something. So
I just don't. I can't think of it where someone could take over a business and totally mess it up more. It's like on purpose you're trying to mess everything up. And who knows? Maybe he was. Maybe he is. I don't know. But anyway, um, uh, Terry, what presented you like unique challenges for putting this one together, different than some of your other ones?
Part of it was the era. Most of the plays that we have done on Imaginary Theater have either been current times or we did a futuristic one.
Yeah.
But this is a century old, and I wanted to be sure that we had the sound right, that the voices, the way of speaking, the ambient sounds, that those were all correct. I found some recordings, and Roy did too, of speeches, recorded speeches, one of which actually initially seemed to be Debs himself, but in fact it was an actor playing Debs, and others have read his speeches. But we don't, as far as we know, we were unable to find his actual sound, even though there was recorded sound in,
Yeah.
the early part of the 20th century. So we assumed some things, and Roy and I talked about this, and speech patterns and so forth. But again, I give the actors great credit for evoking that era, that sound. But I faced the same challenge with music. We picked songs that were of the World War I period, which was good both because it was appropriate
Mhm.
and because it was free. It was no longer covered by copyright.
That's nice.
Yeah.
You start
And then
writing all your stuff back then. It's like,
yeah. And then for the sound effects, when we had street sounds, we couldn't have uh, cars for the most part.
Yeah.
There were very few horseless carriages in 1918.
Yeah.
We didn't want to hear airplanes flying overhead. If a telephone rang, it had to be an old-fashioned sounding,
Yeah.
and so forth. But those were good challenges. Those were good problems. They made it more. It was a lot more fun to do that way.
Well, I'm going to throw out one challenge that I think you've had since the beginning of doing this whole thing, and I've always wanted to kind of explain to me a little bit more. I believe, from talking to you before, that no actors are ever together at the same time. So if I'm an actor, I'm reading all of my lines sequentially, apparently, and pretending that someone's saying the other line, I would assume, or they're doing it with you and you're reading the other part so they have somebody to react off of. I don't know how you do that. One, do you do that with read with people or something to get it more the timing better, or do you have them just do it in isolation and send it to you and then take those clips and put them all together? And if so, if you do that by themselves, is it hard for your actors to act like they're having a dialogue when they're sort of having a one-sided conversation in reality? I don't know. So
The answer is all of the above.
okay.
I have read. I didn't do it in this particular play, and I don't think we've mentioned the title, by the way. This play is called The Most Dangerous Man, which is how Debs was thought of and referred to in some circles. So in The Most Dangerous Man, unlike a few other cases where I did directly read lines with the actors, I didn't do that at all this time. Some of them did have scene partners they in recording them they worked with, but I think the majority of them did it as a work of as a process of imagination.
Mhm.
They, in their head, they heard the other person in the scene, and they took pauses. There's actually an advantage to getting individual files, audio files, for me as the editor, because I don't have to worry about the timing. I control the timing.
Mhm.
So for the actors, on one hand, of course, it's a disadvantage because they don't have that energy and that joy, that artistic experience of working with another person. But for the director slash editor, I get to control how closely speeches abut with each other, how
So
they
you're saying you can, if you're thinking, oh, this is something where the guy's not going to immediately answer, he's going to think for a second, you give, like, you create a false pause
That's right.
that
That's right.
wasn't there when he recorded it necessarily,
And by contrast, sometimes if they take too long a pause, to my ear, I will tighten it up a little bit.
oh
Yeah.
wow.
Or
It's
even
one of the great
overlap.
or overlap. Exactly right. It's one of the advantages of the technology available to us. And there's one other thing that I hesitate to say out loud, but just among us. Um, there were a couple of times, and Roy was very good at pointing these out to me, a couple of times when an actor either mispronounced a word or or it just didn't work for some reason. And I was able to, I've gotten pretty good at this. I'll pat myself on the back to that extent. I was able to take a word that they had used elsewhere in the script and insert it where it belonged. So if they said a word that I didn't like the second time, I would go back to the first time, grab it, and put it in the second time.
That's
Okay.
awesome.
To give a specific example of that, one of the actors, although they started doing Debs's name, saying Debs, at some point there, for whatever reasons, switched to Dibs
Oh, yeah.
as the name that they were using, and Terry was very good at weeding those out and getting the right pronunciation in of the name. Obviously, the actor, on listening to it again, didn't realize
Well, that's
what
the
they
part
had
that
done.
threw me off because he'd sometimes couldn't find the male actor saying Debs, and so he'd take a male line, Debs, and put it over a female. But it just kind of blends in. It's fine. It's okay.
Well, and we also have, for those who've only listened to the first one, you will already know that there's some crowd scenes. And so I had the actors, all of the actors, reading the lines as part of the crowd. And so I could put them all together. And if that wasn't enough, I would sweeten it with pre-recorded crowd sounds.
And that part, honestly, was surprising to me. I was like, how did he do that? I was just trying to, in my brain, halfway I'm listening to this story and halfway I'm thinking of the technical side of how do they do all this stuff? Because I just find it so interesting. And with old time radio, so often they would have everybody there and it would be done live and they'd all be on different mics or they'd share mics or whatever they would do. And that's a whole nother piece of choreography of trying to get all the actors to be in the right places and say the right things at the right time and all of that. But you're dealing with it in a completely different way than old time radio, as far as I know, did. I think there were very few shows, if any, that would do it quite the way you're doing this. Um, well, and I don't think they had the editing techniques and ability that with modern technology you have and things either. So
Roy, should we talk about the stereo effect, how we separated
yeah, I
people?
was going to ask about
Yeah,
that.
why don't you talk about that, because I think it does add. I don't know what the other people think, but I think it does add to the sense of reality
Mhm.
by having the people coming from different directions.
And Roy quite correctly pointed out that at times the characters sounded like they were together when they should have been separate, or vice versa, in the wrong places. And this software that I've been using, fortunately, gives me the ability to use a stereo effect, so I can put one actor on one mic and another actor on another mic, even though they recorded in mono.
Right.
I get to create an artificial stereo effect.
And that's Elliot Lewis when he was doing radio shows in the 70s and in the early 80s. His were very well known for using the stereo and having different actors talk on different mics and having a dialogue it was great. And what I think is it's something that you never hear in old time radio because they didn't have that ability. I think they would have otherwise. So
Sure.
everything in old time radio is very static, very down the center. And to hear something that actually broadens it out, it just reminds you, oh, this is newer, this is fresh, this is a more current piece than those of the. I think it's great. I think I love
One
it.
technique they used back in the day, which I've learned from and stolen, is because they didn't have stereo, the way they could have the effect of somebody arriving or leaving is by increasing or lowering the volume.
Mhm.
So it could sound like somebody was approaching you or walking
Right.
away.
Yeah, you couldn't really go side to side, but you can go back and forward in a
Correct.
way. It would feel like, and it can be artificial. They could also simulate it in real life by having somebody drop the gun or whatever back
Right.
further in the recording area, and it sounds like it's further back.
And the actors would do that too, of course.
Yeah,
They would
yeah.
walk away from the microphone if they were supposed to be going away.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, and that worked beautifully. Well, let's go back. Kathy, you got another question for him or anything that's comes up that you're thinking?
Like I said, I've got some questions for like I've got some history nerd questions that I could always post in the chat for later. So.
Okay. John, you have anything more you want to go with?
No, I just I would agree with you, Buck, that the dynamics of the stereo is really well done. You know, you look at something in the early days of stereo, and they've got something in one ear, like the drums of a song, and you've got something in another ear, like the voice. And then if you're only listening on one ear, you're totally missing something. But this was well done, where if you were only listening in one ear, like I must admit I was doing, you still catch everything. I was totally immersed. I didn't even have those technical questions because I was so focused on the story and what was happening, even though I was only in one ear. So I'll have to re-listen again in stereo.
Well, John, not everyone can think of multiple things at the same time. Some of us can only have so much that our brain can contain. And so I understand that of you. It makes total sense.
Yeah.
Anyway, but I do think it's really interesting how, John and I present old time radio shows that we play for people and they really enjoy them and all that. But there's this whole other piece of modern radio that people are creating on modern audio performances, whatever you want to call it, audio dramas and things. And it's lovely, just everything that's going on out there. I've listened to a lot of it. A lot of it's not very professional sounding or whatever. There's some issues with it, with the actors, because most people, like Terry was saying, do this for free. They don't, it doesn't generate enough money usually to pay people and things. And it's lovely that Terry's trying to pay people. And for sure, folks if you're fans of this show or you're fans of my show, help Terry out by using his what's it called? Kickstarter, right?
Yeah, we've got a Kickstarter campaign, and within the show we have a Patreon page, but
Yep.
Right now we've got less than 30 days to reach our goal on Kickstarter. It's not a big goal; it's $700. So I
Okay.
hope we'll be able to reach that.
Well, John can cover that. So anyway, in Canadian, I don't know what that does here. You'll probably be short. I don't know. But I just, but I was going to say was your shows to me are some of the best I've ever heard. Just the way they're put together. I mean, it's so professional. And even like you say, I was like, oh, okay, he's advertising Patreon now because he hasn't. I don't think you've done that in previous shows that I can think of. How obtrusive is this going to be? And it's just a little bit at the beginning, and because it's you saying it, and it just kind of works. And then it's at the end too, and it's like it doesn't distract from the show. I don't like sometimes, man. I'm listening to a podcast or something, and there's something that comes on where it's completely different product that makes like no sense to the show, and you're just like, why? Why are they doing this? Why are they wrecking their show? I mean, that's one of the reasons I don't really do advertising on mine. I try to do the same thing you're doing, like
Rinse so
Patreon or
white.
something. But
Rinse
yeah.
so white.
Well, we learned from Jack
Elizabeth.
Benny. You know?
Elizabeth.
That's right. Speaking of Jack Benny, I should have said this from the very beginning.
Yeah.
Roy has a Jack Benny show connection. Roy, you want to pull back the curtain and tell these fine folks?
Yes, well, when I was in junior high,
Mhm.
I dated Frank Nelson's daughter.
Wow.
Wow.
So you rang
And
the
We went
doorbell and
together
it
for we went together for a
Yes.
whole year.
I can
Bonnie, and
imagine.
I
I
had
bet
I
you the first time you met him, you're like, I I really want to date your daughter. Are you okay with that? And he's like, yes.
well,
I'm sure.
what was interesting. A couple of things were interesting. I had dinner at their house a few times, and he was there,
Yeah.
and he's a terribly nice man. Uh, as I mentioned to Terry, you know, I'm I'm this green behind the ears kid, uh, 12 years old, who's dating his daughter, and he treated me like an adult. There was no condescension. There was no backhand anything with him. He's a perfectly decent guy. His voice uh, is put on in the show.
Yeah.
He had a he has a I presume he's dead by now, but
Yeah.
he had a baritone voice
Mhm.
that was very smooth. And when he did the show, obviously he did other things with his voice to make the comic effects work.
Mhm. Well, and he got what, a little miffed that he became so stereotyped. He loved before the Benny Show and things. He had a broader range of things they would ask him to do, and so you can hear his. I don't know if you're hearing his normal voice, but you're hearing a different voice than he uses there, in because he did perform dramas and comedies and everything in between. And luckily we have recordings of all of that. The other thing is, if you listen to his interviews, he's so interesting because he knows everything he ever did. He has like a book that he just brings with him to the interviews, and he can go through the book and he can say, oh, on this date I recorded this, on this date I recorded that. So people will ask him, were you on this show? It sounds like you, or whatever. And he can flip through his book and go, yeah, that was me, or no, that
Wow.
wasn't me, because I don't have anything shown for that. The only thing they tripped him up on that I've ever known was somebody was asking him about his appearance on the that Christmas Bear show. What is that?
Cinnamon Bear.
Cinnamon Bear. Cinnamon Bear. And he was adamant that he didn't have it in his books, that he was on Cinnamon Bear and things. But then he listened to it and he's like, oh, yeah, that's definitely me.
Yeah.
And the only thing he could come up with is because it wasn't a paid gig,
Oh.
he did it for, I don't know what you call it, pro bono, or he just did it because he knew somebody or whatever, that's why he didn't document it down. But he'd always document down his paid gigs. And very few radio folks, when you talk to them, can point out anything. They're like, well, I did some suspense at
Yeah.
some point, and maybe I did this or that. And or I love it when the interviewers are talking to him going, I love your performance in suspense. It was just fantastic when you did this episode. And they're like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't remember doing that. I don't remember ever showing up there. I have no idea.
Roy,
Or
do
they'll
you
play it
remember
for him and
whether
they're like, oh, that was me.
Roy, do you remember whether he talked about his work? Did you know him from his work?
No, he the specifics of his work never came up. I mean, uh, it, tangentially, obviously, at age 12, 13, you're not driving, so you're
No.
dependent upon your parents to drive. And Bonnie would say to me, "Well, Dad's got X and so that he's doing today. So can your folks
Yeah.
Oh
drive
yeah,
us
yeah.
here or
So
drive us
you
there?"
knew what he
Because
was doing. You knew what
he
his
know, oh yeah,
profession
yeah,
was with
no,
things.
he knew he knew what he's about, but he was not one of these egocentric guys who had to be talking about himself all the time.
Mhm.
And he was not, if I hadn't known he was on the Jack Benny show, Jack Benny's name never
Right.
came up at dinner or anything like that. I mean, he just didn't talk about those things.
Yeah.
He talked about family matters. He talked about what was going on in the valley. He talked about other things like that, and that was it. Work was something that he didn't impose on other people.
Right. And just to, so like, what time frame are you sort of talking about? It was the 50, 40. I don't know when, 760. I don't know.
Well, I was born in 1941.
Okay.
So I was 12, 13 years old in 52,
Wow.
that range around, that range
Oh
around
man,
there.
what of my fans, listeners, everything? What would they give to be in your spot and be
Yeah.
able to talk to Frank Nelson in 1952?
That's
You're
prime
talking
Frank
that is
Nelson.
prime. That is so prime. That is one of the peaks of the Benny Show.
Yeah.
Frank Nelson is at that point. He's probably been on or going to be on very soon. The I Love Lucy show. He's got so many things going on at that point. Wow. Wow. What an exciting time. But you're 12 and I'm sure you were more interested in his daughter than you were at him. So
Yeah.
Well, yeah, Bonnie and I did very nicely together. We had a lot of fun. We had a lot of fun together, and
oh, good.
I was, particularly in retrospect, it was a good time.
Okay. And there was no like she didn't carry on his thing. So like when you said,
Oh
"Can I
no,
give
no,
you a
no, no.
kiss?" She didn't say, "Well, yes, you can give me a
Yeah.
kiss." Right.
Well, I mean, the other thing is that when you go to North Hollywood, what was then North Hollywood High School, and then afterwards Hollywood High School, some of these people are connected to movies
Oh, right, right.
and TV that it's just part of their lives, and they or
And part
their
of the
father,
culture there. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Makes
their
sense.
father's lives. Uh, when I was on the swim team in Hollywood High, Melvin Shavelson's kid swam swam with me. I mean, there's
Yeah.
I lifeguarded at Dana Andrews parties. I mean that kind of thing, and you just don't think of it. And I
Yeah.
almost got ran over by Bob Hope twice. Uh, uh,
On
he
purpose?
I don't think so. No, he lived down the road for us in this estate, this walled-in estate that had a one-hole golf course in the backyard.
Yeah.
And he was one of the this is Toluca Lake, and he's one of the few stars, quote unquote, who you would see walking around periodically or driving around periodically. Uh, he also never put on airs with other people when he was around. I ran into him in Palm Springs one time buying a T-shirt. I mean, it just, some of these people are
Yeah.
quite pleasant when you when you meet him in that kind of way.
Yeah, which totally makes sense. It's just for us, they're so iconic legends. You can't
Oh yeah,
imagine
Yeah.
Bob Hope ever buying a T-shirt or something. And of course he
yeah.
did. I mean, he was in a grocery store at some point buying toilet paper, I'm sure. So it's everybody has their lives and they have to live and things, but we put them on pedestals or things. So it's great to hear the humanness of it. Well, I want to ask Terry another question about the shows and things. So Terry, this is a four-parter. I think the one right before this, maybe you did a two-parter. Is that or am I?
No, it was two before this. The most recent one before this was one of the shortest ones we did.
Oh,
It was
standalone.
called
Okay.
Fixer Upper.
Okay.
It was kind of a
Now going forward, does
story.
this make you want to do more multi-part ones, or does this make
Yeah,
you go,
maybe,
or is this an
maybe.
anomaly, or I don't know?
And I enjoyed doing it this way. I would happily collaborate with Roy again. One of the things that I've come to appreciate is historical fiction, and I wrote a historical novel some years ago. I've got a one-man show right now about Ronald Reagan that's touring, and in the process of researching the Debs play, I called uh, a presidential library. I think it was the McKinley Library because they are in Ohio, and I was trying to get some tidbit of information, and then afterwards, when we launched it, I wanted to let a few organizations know, and there's a Debs Foundation, but there's also there's a connection. I don't want to say specifically yet, but in the last episode, there's a mention of Warren Harding, President Warren G. Harding.
Mhm.
And so I called that presidential library, and the woman who runs the place was delighted to know about this because in Marion, Ohio. The Debs story is known, and of course, there's a connection to Harding. And why do I mention this? Oh, because I'm looking for opportunities to promote this. And I thought, well, has anybody done any dramatization of Harding's life? I asked her, and she said, well, yeah, there was one really bad play. I said, that's great because I love not having to compete with another good play.
Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe
Oh, no, there was a great book about his mistress and the secret child she had, and so that there's been more about and then another book about his wife Florence, who possibly poisoned him on the.
Well, and then there was a three-hander about Harding, Thomas Edison, and Henry Ford. It was an audio play. And it was interesting. It was kind of odd, but it was completely fictitious. It was about the three of them going on a camping trip together.
Wow.
Wow. Oh, sure. They used to with Harvey Firestone, I think. So they did all these things. Well, if you can always edit this back out, but is it okay if I ask my history nerd questions?
Yes, please.
One thing I so loved about your story here about Debs and the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act of 1918, is because a film I am restoring was made at that exact time. It was first released in September 1918 by this actor director Francis Ford, who's the forgotten older brother of John Ford. And a pivotal moment in this movie, the movie's called The Craving, and it's about a scientist who has he's battling an alcoholism problem, but he's also he's got a secret formula for an explosive, and he's battling a scientist from India who's using sort of mind control to try and get the secret from him. Manages to, but Ford's character, the scientist, in his drunken stupor, falls unconscious, and just kind of like the ghost of Christmas past, his rational self comes out of his body and takes him up, and the two of them travel to the battlefields of Europe to criticize the needless slaughter of troops on the European battlefields, which would be so connected to this idea that the draft is bad and the war is bad and all. And as far as I can tell, Ford, it was not edited out of the film. It was not censored. He got to show this film. Advertising and criticism of the film really doesn't talk about that. So it's like, either they didn't want to get him in trouble, or the film actually finally came out in January 1919.
Oh, that would they wouldn't have gone after him then. I mean, Debs's timing was awful.
Yeah.
Had he given that speech in like September of 1918, they wouldn't have gone after him. The war was over 2 months later. By the time they got their act together to go after him, it wouldn't have been worth their time. But unfortunately for him, he gave the speech too early in 1918 when it wasn't yet clear what was going to happen in the war.
We have similar things going on with the protests on college campuses right now.
The
earliest ones get the most, later ones don't get the publicity that the earlier ones did. But as I said, I was doing some research, and there were very few anti-war films made in the U.S. at the time. The U.S. films were all, whether the Creel Committee asked for them or people were trying to be patriotic, everything was about horrible Germans and, be patriotic Americans and win the war. And it's not until the Big Parade or Paths of Glory or
All Quiet on the Western Front.
All Quiet on the Western Front that serious criticism, condemnations of the wastefulness of the war come out. And so this film I'm releasing from 1918/1919 is a very early example of that.
Good.
And so now I'll bring in, thank you for the research on the Espionage Act, and I will put that in my footnotes, why that he managed to stay away from it. So,
well, as we all know, because the Vietnam War became so unpopular and so divisive, the Justice Department, as far as I know, never once invoked the Espionage Act to go after anti-war protesters. They certainly could have legally. It was essentially the same basis as when it was created. But, you know, the justice system is not only about the law, it's about practical matters, as we discussed in
Well,
this.
it also would have been tricky with the Vietnam thing because war was never declared,
That's right.
Well, that's true.
and going after people for being against the war would have gotten them into a legal morass that they probably didn't want to get into at that time. You go after them for the violence, you go after them for other things, but you don't go after them for being against the war, because you're going to just get yourself in one of these tar baby situations you'll never get out of.
Yeah.
As we will learn in the subsequent episodes of The Most Dangerous Man, this particular case, the Debs case, really tested the justice system, not only at the local level, but all the way up to the Supreme Court. And as a one-time law student, that's one of the things I found most fascinating about this story was the legal implication.
Yeah. And
did you know much about it beforehand?
So well.
I'm sorry, what'd you say, Kathy?
You dramatized that so well.
Oh, thank you.
Hint of subsequent episodes. So.
Daryl, I knew a little bit about the Debs case. I mean, I read about him in high school, but I learned so much in the process of researching and writing this play and reading the scenes that Roy wrote. It was and we got to read the transcripts of the trial. It was a really wonderful educational experience.
Because I don't see how, once you started talking about this, you could possibly go, oh, this isn't a good fit for my show. It's like it's such a perfect fit. I mean, because your shows always are echoing to, it's one of the pieces that Imaginary Theater is all about, is that your shows have echoes that reach into today from whatever's going on in the show. And they're not direct, they're parallels, they're things where you can connect the dots to a modern situation usually. And in this case, it's the same thing, but instead of a make-believe story or something, it's a real story that you found that does that on its own. And
I do worry about being too on the nose at times. John and I'm sure could discuss this in greater detail, because I think we both worry about offending people. That's certainly not my intention. I have political views, and sometimes they leak out, but I try, having been a news reporter, I try to keep my opinions to myself.
Yeah.
But I'm happy to point people in a direction and let them draw their own conclusions.
I wish John would pick up on that. John just shares his political views left and right. It's just horrendous.
It might be great to have a short section at the end for further reading or further viewing.
Oh, that's a great idea, Kathy.
Because I found an article, I was fascinated by your Clyde Miller character, and I looked him up on Wikipedia and found that his life truly was transformed by this experience. So
he ends up being a very different person than you think he's going to be at the start by the time the whole thing is over.
But he goes on to found he founds a center for the study of propaganda.
Yep.
In New York. It's fascinating. He goes on for years. That's so.
A professor at my alma mater, Santa Clara University, wrote extensively about him, and I think there's a professor at Columbia who has done some.
I think that's what I stumbled onto. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Miller ends up dying in Australia. He was so discouraged by what was going on in the United States in the post World War II era that he just couldn't stay here anymore, and he left.
See, and John and I are trying our best to look intelligent here and go, yes, Australia, that makes sense when people pass away. Yes, and the points Kathy makes, I was thinking the same thing. I would have brought those up myself, but certainly Francis Ford was quite the director.
Well, I told you it was history nerd time. So,
Kathy, I have to thank you for that short documentary that you produced, that you sent me the link to.
thank you.
I enjoyed it very much. And I did not know. I just always assumed that Coppola was named Francis Ford in honor of him, and that's not the case.
Well, the story is that they both have a Henry Ford connection.
That's right.
That Francis Feeney saw the advertising for a Model T. It was 1908, and one of the few times that Henry Ford paid for advertising back in the day. And so he says he loved curly QFs. So he says, I'll take that. And then Carmine Coppola, he worked for he was the conductor of the Detroit Symphony. And the Ford company heavily sponsored them on like NPR, classical music performances. And so he named his son to honor his son, middle name Ford.
Huh.
So they're connected through Henry Ford, which would
And to bring-
probably annoy all of them. So
And to bring the Coppola story to today, well, last night I watched, I guess, the previous night's episode of Law and Order, and Sofia Coppola, who is a director in her own right, was one of the guest actors in that episode.
Oh,
oh, fantastic.
It
Well,
was
I
a
hope
really interesting episode, by the way.
okay.
that's fantastic. Well, that's the Blu-ray/DVD will be done this summer, and I'll have some copies to hand out.
Oh, nice.
So
That's exciting. Well, let's see. I'm trying to figure out, Terry, is there anything else you want to say in wrapping this up?
I really appreciate you spending so much time asking us about this and talking about this.
Yeah.
I really hope that this will be a play that that most people can listen to, learn from, be entertained by, and that it will provoke discussions about current issues.
Well, honestly, I think I really enjoyed it. Certainly, I get the impression that John and Kathy both enjoy. I mean, and we represent really a diverse group of people. If you can satisfy all three of us and we find it interesting, that's pretty good. I mean, and it doesn't have Jack Benny in it. I mean, if it had Jack Benny in it, then we're all on board. But this, you featured no Jack Benny, and he could have been in there because he was around at that time frame.
there you go. He'd be playing in the pit at the Orpheum Theater in Canton, Ohio, while everybody's gathered at Nimishillen Park. So
that would be funny to have him in there for a little bit.
I guess I should tell you that the local community theater in my hometown in Bakersfield, California, is going to be having a staged reading of 3 episodes of Imaginaire Theater.
Oh,
wow.
Oh, very good, very good.
Perhaps in their next season, we will actually put it on stage and have it dramatized
Right.
in front of.
that's fantastic. Are you going to do it? Set it up like it's a radio show?
That's
how
the
are you
plan.
going to visualize it?
That's the plan. No, it's going to be a play within a play, and so the Imaginaire Theater radio plays will be performed by the actors on the stage as actors doing a radio show.
Going to be the second part of his 2-parter and the third part of this one and then some random one. And so it should be interesting. It should work out really well.
And there'll be
Transcribed at some earlier time.
And there'll be music.
Oh, fun.
There will be music.
So it is going to be a musical.
More tingles.
Okay. So you're turning your shows and I think that'd be great.
Congratulations.
Yeah. That's exciting to hear. I knew you were looking into that or thinking about it. So I'm glad that all came about. Boy, you just got everything firing these days, between that and your Reagan play and just, yeah, my goodness, that's awesome.
Yeah. Well, and then, my new vodka label is coming out. No, wait a minute. That's sorry.
Yeah, we'll advertise on that. That's good.
It'll be good for making Phillips screwdrivers. So
That's right.
And then what's cool is you've been showing up for some of our podcasts again, which is great too. So, I mean, I don't know how much time you'll have to do that, keep doing that, but we love having you. So, and Roy, it was wonderful meeting you. And
Well, I was glad to meet all of you.
You
This
did
has
such
been
a-
fun. I enjoyed myself.
yeah, it was so interesting. But Roy, just the part I didn't get, I think it may have been covered briefly, but like, have you been writing like for most of you? Has that been your kind of your career, or what's your career sort of been, or your
I started
trajectory?
out as an academic British historian.
Wow.
I received a lot of flack from friends saying the only thing you know anything about is the year 1619. And I was terribly offended because I knew 1621 much better. And I uh, I began writing biographies as a academic historian,
Okay.
and they were mainly biographies of people who nobody had ever heard of.
Right.
And I then wanted the challenge of writing a biography of somebody that people had heard of, but seeing if I could find a different angle. So I'd always been a keen sailor
Hmm.
and always wanted to go to the South Pacific. So I started on William Bligh,
Oh, okay.
and I wrote a biography of him. And the agent that I was using for the book said, it's too long. Here's a list of the things you got to cut out.
Oh,
And she gave me this list of things to cut out. I said, God, it's the best stuff. You're telling me to get rid of. She says, well, use it for something else. Do something else with it, but don't put it in here.
Oh.
So I was friends with the drama teacher at my university. He said, why don't you make a play out of it? So I made a play out of it, and from then on, I've been writing plays and short
wonderful.
stories, and did a memoir and some other things like that. And I just sort of drifted into all of this. And once I stopped teaching, I had more time to do it.
Well, fantastic. Well, I hope you do more projects with Terry because this is really a beautiful project you guys have come
Well,
up with. And
I'm pleased all of you have liked it.
yeah, yeah.
That's fabulous.
And I've noticed Terry's writing ability and working with you has gone up tremendously. So
That's 100% true.
Fourfold,
yeah,
fourfold, or is it
Fourfold,
double,
exactly.
double? Yeah.
and he's heading towards a 24-hour episode here soon, and so he certainly needs co-writers for that.
Right. Daryl pointed out early on that as each episode came out over the last 4 or 5 years, whatever it's been now, that they got progressively longer. And Daryl, estimated that we would reach the point where the next play would be 24 hours long eventually.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, this one will cumulatively run about an hour.
Yeah. Your longest one?
It's clearly the longest one, but within those four, we have one of the shortest ones and one of the longest ones.
Yeah. Yeah. And I can't wait to hear the rest. And John's heard them. I have a question for John, actually, just
Okay.
curious. The first one is just it's one of the best I've ever heard of, like something that makes you interested in what's going to go on, and you don't know what direction it's going to go. And it's such a low key sort of thing that it's a slow burn, and then at the end you're like, oh, I want to hear more. For the other ones, do you feel like are they more like cliffhangery, or I mean, how's the flow go from episode to episode? Is that pretty much
Well,
stay?
episode one is just the introduction. I barely even remember episode one because you dive so much further into it because it's almost like one of these suspense movies or something like that. Like the more you get into it, for sure you're more likely to
It
click
just
the
keeps
next
drawing
one
you
right
further and
away if
further.
it's
Oh, that's
available.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Okay. Anyway, so I guess we'll stop there, and please, please, please check the show notes wherever this is posted, whether it's going to be on YouTube, it's going to be on my podcasts and everything, because that'll give you links to all of Terry's podcasts, Terry's YouTube channel. We'll have the link to the Kickstarter and to the Patreon. And so please listen to the shows. That's number one. Number two is, if you like them, please support them at whatever level you can, because the more you support them, Terry's going to follow. I know Terry, he's going to put all that money back into getting more actors for the next one, getting more pieces together. And these people they're doing such quality work. They deserve to be paid. They deserve to, and so let's make that happen. So, all right.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks to all of you.
Yeah,
This was great.
thank you.
Oh, this is great.
This is Imagine Air Theater, I'm your host, Terry Phillips. You're about to hear episode 1 of a special 4-part miniseries called The Most Dangerous Man. It's co-authored by Roy Schreiber and me. Unlike previous plays in this podcast, which are works of fiction, this one is a historical drama based on real events. Whether you're a new listener or a regular, welcome to the program, and thanks for joining us. In 1917, the world was in the throes of its first global conflict, the war to end all wars. After America joined the fight, Congress passed laws prohibiting anyone from interfering with the war effort. Violators could face long prison sentences. But in the American Midwest, one popular labor leader was vehemently against the war. Who was this person, and how far was he willing to go in opposition? Stay tuned for the first episode of The Most Dangerous Man. But first, if you like our plays and want to hear more, you can support us by becoming an Imaginaire Theater patron on Patreon. Just visit www.patreon.com/Imaginaire. I'll have more information about that at the end of this episode. And now, on with the show. June 1918. World War I still rages in Europe, with millions of casualties mounting and no end yet in sight. One anti-war activist, Eugene V. Debs, has drawn the attention of a certain patriotic journalist in Ohio.
Yes?
Mr. Wirtz, that newspaper reporter is here.
Thanks, Janet. Send him in.
I'm Clyde Miller, Cleveland Plain Dealer.
Edwin Wirtz. Nice to meet you, Miller. Come in. Have a seat.
Thanks for seeing me, sir.
So, you came to talk about Eugene Debs?
Yes, sir. As a federal prosecutor, I'm sure you know that Debs led that big railroad strike against Pullman.
Of course. That was back in '94. We locked him up for 6 months after he violated a court injunction.
Right. But that didn't stop him. Debs got more involved in politics.
Yes.
He founded the Socialist Party and ran for president 4 times. In 1900. '04, '08.
I'm aware of all that, Miller.
But what you don't know, Mr. Wirtz, is that he might try to defy the Espionage Act.
What's that you say?
Debs is planning to make an anti-war speech next week. My sources tell me he's been invited to talk at a rally in Canton on June 16th.
Well, I don't see how that...
They're expecting a huge crowd. More than 1,000 people.
Good Lord.
Some folks are talking about a general strike. Marches to the state capitol. It could lead to riots.
Now, wait a minute.
I'm telling you, Mr. Wirtz, Debs can be very persuasive. He's a real charmer. A most dangerous man. He has to be stopped.
Still, this is a free country.
But we're at war.
Oh, I know. Nevertheless, I can't have him arrested without explicit proof of interference with the war effort.
The speech could be the proof you need.
Where exactly is this rally supposed to happen?
Let me see. Nimisila Park, on the northeast side of town.
All right. Well, listen, Miller. You attend that rally as a journalist, take down what Debs actually says, then let me know.
I'll do that.
And provided Washington approves, I'll consider pressing charges, if you bring me concrete evidence.
Oh, you'll have the evidence, all right.
That is assuming he even shows up, of course.
Of course. I only hope it doesn't come in the form of blood in the streets. The fate of the free world may depend on what we do here.
All right, calm down.
I'll telephone you right afterwards with a personal account of what happens.
Fine. And you would be willing to testify in court?
Certainly. Anything to stop that traitor. My paper will have a photographer there, too. Don't worry. We'll get you what you need to put him in jail, where he belongs.
Meanwhile, outside a modest home in the small town of Terre Haute, Indiana.
Crap, mother! Go back to Berlin! Traitor! Traitor!
Eugene, you're bleeding. Here, sit down. Put this towel around your hand.
Now, don't make a fuss, Katie. I'm fine.
And you want to go all the way to Canton, Ohio to give a speech? Look what happens when you go outside here at home.
It seems to me that making a speech is less dangerous than planting flowers on our front porch. I'm not hiding in the house all day. Besides, I don't see what one thing has to do with the other.
Jean, what am I going to do with you? They killed President McKinley, didn't they? They took a shot at Teddy Roosevelt, too.
They? Just some crazy loners.
Sure, you say that now.
I've run for president 4 times, and here I am, safe and sound.
Run for president all you like, but do you have to keep telling everyone America should have stayed out of the war?
Yes, my love. Woodrow Wilson and his people made a mistake. They need to make it right.
Even if by stepping outside you make them mad enough to throw rocks at you?
Well, the rocks miss me. They hit the flower pot instead. I just cut myself picking up some broken pieces, see?
You were lucky this time.
But all those boys are getting killed just to make rich men richer. They weren't lucky. I can't ignore it. Come on, Katie.
Come on, Katie me all you want. You keep this up and big trouble is right around the corner.
The government only managed to keep me in jail for a few months, sweetheart, and that was years ago.
I've read those socialist papers of yours. It's worse now.
What did I miss?
The new law that President Wilson just signed.
Well, he signed lots of new laws. Which one?
The one that's so strict you could get 20 years in prison for just saying the Lord's Prayer.
They'd throw me in jail if I said, "Forgive us our trespasses"?
No, they would throw you in jail if you said, "Forgive those who trespassed against us." That could mean you don't want our boys to fight the Germans.
Don't you see? Those people want us to keep our mouths shut and let them get on with their unjust war. I say no golden silences and no to this war.
So we're back to where we started.
We started with you looking after my hand.
We started with me telling you not to go to Canton. Now you sound like you're rehearsing a speech.
Katie, how can I say no to the good people who invited me there?
With jail staring you in the face. I can't figure out how you could say yes.
I could give a speech that doesn't really cross the line. The law says I can't tell soldiers to disobey their officers. I can't say, "Don't be a soldier." And I wouldn't do that. Not exactly. Not in so many words.
What do you mean?
I mean that if I went, I'd be careful. No matter how closely they listened, they would never hear me tell American soldiers not to shoot German soldiers.
Oh, so you wouldn't actually make a speech against the war?
Exactly.
But I don't understand.
I'd simply tell everyone to vote socialist. That way the feds will have to grit their teeth and leave me be.
Oh, my goodness.
That'd stop Rockefeller and his greedy friends from making millions off the war and making everyone's lives miserable.
You really think socialists can get elected and stop the war?
Absolutely, no doubt.
Eugene, you know how frustrating it is when you stick your head up in the clouds.
How's that sticking my head in the clouds?
Oh, honestly.
I mean, women will finally get to vote in the next election. That'll change everything.
Most wives see things like their husbands do.
I'm depending on it, especially in your case.
Very funny.
Seriously, I don't think all those mothers and wives will vote for people who get their menfolk killed.
And do you think socialists can get us out of the war just by snapping their fingers?
That was the first thing Lenin and his socialists did in Russia after they took over. They got out of the war with Germany.
From what I've read, they're still killing a whole lot of people in Russia. It's the one thing you can count on Russians to do.
I never said no to all war. I said no to this capitalist war. Sometimes you've got to fight to save what you believe in.
That's what you'd say in Canton?
I might.
Why not stick to speeches about how everyone could get fair wages? It's what you've said all your life.
And it's what I'll keep saying. But first, we must stop our boys from being slaughtered over there in Europe.
Is that your version of onward Christian soldiers?
You think I believe I'm like Jesus leading his disciples?
It sure sounds like you're doing that. And maybe heading toward your own crucifixion.
I didn't volunteer to go to Canton. The socialists there are feeling down and need encouragement. It's my duty to help.
Listen to yourself. You could get arrested. You could get killed. This speech could give the government a legal way to stop you, to get rid of you.
Like I told you, if I'm careful in what I say, they can't touch me.
Well, I'll bet they're plotting right now to do that.
You might be right, but
Have you thought about what would happen to me if you got this wrong?
of course I've thought about it.
Then why?
It's one of the main reasons I should go.
Despite your best efforts to change it, we still live in a capitalist society. This is still the real world.
I know.
But if you went to Canton and something happened to you, God forbid, I don't know how I'd survive.
Katie, I hate to admit this, but we're nearly broke already. And the people in Canton would pay good money to hear me speak.
We've always made do, and we always will. Together.
I'm doing my best to take care of us.
I know, dearest one, but most men as old as you don't like dancing right on the edge.
As long as I'm dancing with you, my love.
So stay here with me. Don't go to Canton, Eugene.
Will Eugene Debs take a chance? Go to Canton and speak out against the war? Or will his wife Kate persuade him to reconsider, avoid trouble, and stay home with her? Find out next time in Episode 2 of The Most Dangerous Man. You've been listening to The Most Dangerous Man on Imaginaire Theater. This special 4-part miniseries was co-authored by Roy Schreiber and me. The play featured Paul Rogan as Eugene Debs, Tim McCaffrey as Clyde Miller, Stella Valente as Kate Debs, Hayes Dunlap as Edwin Wirtz, and Pilar Uribe as Janet. Script consultant, Mark Boyce. Casting director, Stella Valente. Our theme song comes from Roman Senek. Other music included Over There by George M. Cohan and Keep the Home Fires Burning by Ivor Novello and Lena Gilbert Brown Ford. Imaginaire Theater is made possible by contributions from our listeners. If you like these plays and want to hear more, please support us. Go to patreon.com/Imaginaire. Become a paying member for as little as $1 per month. Again, that's patreon.com/Imaginaire. All one word. We really appreciate your help. I'm Terry Phillips, inviting you to join us again for the next episode of Imaginaire Theater. It's all in your head.